This episode of the Drone Radio Show podcast is presented by Pix4D, the world's leader in 3D mapping software for UAV professionals. Meet other users, try the latest products, and chat to developers at the first Pix4D user conference. Get your early bird tickets at pix4d.com/radio.
Beyond visual line of sight is the Holy Grail. Really not going to get to the Holy Grail until the FAA feels comfortable with remote identification and tracking of drones and knowing who's up there flying and why they're flying and where they're flying.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 214. What are Washington insiders saying about the drone industry? For that question, we turn to Shawn Bullard, president of the Duetto Group, a Capitol Hill-based government relations firm. Shawn has a long career in federal policy. Prior to leading the Duetto Group, Shawn served as vice president of government relations for one of the oldest PR firms in the nation. He was also a senior congressional staff member to a long-serving member of the House Armed Services Committee and Transportation Committee's Merchant Marine and Coast Guard Subcommittee. Throughout his professional career, he has had the pleasure to collaborate with some of the most recognizable brands in the world. He has served on multiple boards, including the Royal Aeronautical Society, the National Press Club, and the Shire School of Policy and Government. In this edition of the Drone Radio Show, Shawn talks about federal UAS policy issues, the 2019 Drone Focus Conference, and he shares with us a new podcast on federal UAV policy that all of us will find of value. But before we hear from Shawn, I want to thank those of you who are supporting my funding campaign. Now you have the option of making a one-time donation in any amount by going to droneradioshow.com/donate. Whether it's $1, $100, or much more, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. And if you'd like to make a monthly contribution, you can still go to patreon.com/droneradioshow. So let's get some insight on federal policy initiatives with Shawn Bullard of the Duetto Group. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Shawn to introduce himself.
I'm Shawn Bullard, and I'm president of the Duetto Group.
Shawn, can you tell us about what you're involved in at the Duetto Group?
What I do is I'm a consultant who works with companies and organizations and associations, the CEO usually, or someone there within the executive office who has a need for someone to help them develop either a policy strategy, a legislative strategy, or a strategy to help them move from one level of performance to a higher level of performance.
Do you work primarily with public agencies or private businesses as well?
Actually, both. And so I have a really strong appreciation for public agencies and local government and public policy and for state and local government. And so I really enjoy working in that space very, very much. But I also have clients who are in the corporate space as well.
So basically what you do is strategic planning and trying to create high-performance organizations.
Most certainly. Most certainly.
So how do drones fit into the Duetto Group?
Very, very well, in that for really, probably a decade now, since the beginning of this decade, I've been very much involved in the UAS space. And it's a perfect example is North Dakota. I mean, North Dakota, when Senator Hoeven was Governor Hoeven, had these many ideas of how to commercialize UAS in the national airspace system. And so I was very much interested in that concept. And, hindsight's 2020, but if you look how far, North Dakota has come in the last decade, it's just phenomenal. The growth of those ideas that were really well before their time.
Does the work with organizations cover helping them figure out how to use drones? Or is it more about making them aware of the policies so they can position themselves accordingly?
It's actually the latter. I am not in any way, shape, or form helping anyone learn how to fly their drone. I am actually in that space where I'm helping folks understand where they might be able to fly in a certain space.
What do you see as some of the major policy issues at the federal level?
There's a couple of policy issues out there that are at the top, and it's remote ID, it's counter UAS, it's ops over people. Those are really core areas that are at the fore right now. Remote ID and tracking is something that, even though a lot of folks say that beyond visual line of sight is the holy grail, really not going to get to the holy grail until the FAA feels comfortable with remote identification and tracking of drones and knowing who's up there flying and why they're flying and where they're flying. It's the most important thing right now to the FAA.
Do you think we'll see some progress in these areas?
There are some real challenges out there in the space. I mean, we've come a very, very long way over the last decade or so, but there are still some major hurdles that are out there. I mean, the FAA just recently came out with its ops over people rule and for comment, and that is something that is very, very important to a lot of folks in the UAS space, but you're also not going to get ops over people until the FAA and DHS and DOD and some other federal agencies feel comfortable with remote identification. And so FAA kind of did some things kind of backwards a little bit, where they had the rule on ops over people come out, which was a little bit backwards, where remote ID probably should have come out earlier, which we might see a remote ID rule come out probably the first part of next year or late this year. But, there's a lot that still needs to be done before we are where a lot of folks would think we need to be.
What's at play in regard to moving on remote ID?
It's technology. Obviously, the technology is one where it needs to be developed, but also the policy is there. And so what's happening now is that there is a committee called ASTM F38 that is developing some recommendations that are going to come out very, very soon within the next 60 days. And those will be used as almost like guardrails before a remote ID rule comes out. And so your listeners who are in this space are going to want to actually access ASTM F38's recommendations, because they're going to be used for quite some time, for years before the rulemaking process has come to fruition. And so anyone who's kind of familiar with the policy process and rulemaking in Washington, D.C., is that when the rule comes out, you're really only halfway there. And if a rule is approved within, by an agency within 18 to 24 months, that's warp speed. That's really hypersonic. It can actually take longer.
When you say approval by the agencies who are affected by the rule have to weigh in on the rule and approve the rule. Is that correct?
There are several agencies that are given a bite at that apple. Yes, you're correct. And it makes it even more complicated in this case because we're talking about security, privacy, and safe UAS aviation operations. And so there's a lot of agencies that want to make sure that we get it right the first time.
Are you able to give us any insight into the thinking of Congress as to how they view the UAV space?
There's a very, very strong appreciation for UAS and the national airspace system and the safe integration of UAS in the airspace system, and very, very, very strong, and especially from North Dakota's congressional delegation.
Obviously, we have a few years of rulemaking to weigh in on, but in the meantime, what advice would you offer to stakeholders in the industry?
Over the last 10 years, there's just a lot of people who've worked really, really hard, since the beginning of this decade to ensure that we have an opportunity to fly drones in the national airspace system. So I would say that often I tell folks, look at drones simply as a tool to do something better. Drones are not the end all be all. They're simply an extension to what you or someone is already doing well.
And it goes back to ensuring that one has a long-term sustainable plan to achieve success.
In the early years, a lot of people were trying to break in, and people are still trying to break into UAS, and they're failing. And then they're failing to realize that it's not easy to make revenue, even when the policies are now in your favor. For years, a lot of folks would complain that the technology was well ahead of the policy. And really today, you've got some pretty amazing opportunities now that you didn't have just a year or two ago. It's taken a lot of folks a long time and a lot of hard work to help get to the point where we are today in the UAS industry. And the only thing I would add is that, the ecosystem now exists. The policies now exist. A federal government now and federal agencies now that are willing to work with you now exists. And, a decade ago, I could not have honestly said that, and now I can. So if you've got a great idea that leverages UAS technologies, that helps make life a little easier for the pizza delivery guy, or can help the local sheriff catch bad guys, or deliver cargo halfway across the country, you should seize the opportunity, because now the resources exist where they once did not.
Drone Focus is scheduled for May 29th in Fargo, North Dakota. What will you be doing at Drone Focus?
So I plan to talk about how I believe the industry is evolving. What are some of those landmines I believe everyone should be on the lookout for, and just kind of provide kind of a broad overview of what the future holds.
Will you be on a panel or speaking?
I'll have a session, and I'll also have a lunch conversation.
What topics will you be covering?
One is going to be talking about what's out there on the horizon, what to look out for, landmines to watch out for. And then the other one will be most likely on urban air mobility and the transport of people in autonomous vehicles via air taxi.
For me, as a city planner, I'm naturally curious about the air mobility opportunities and their impact on cities. What intrigues you most about urban air mobility?
So one of the things that intrigues me about urban air mobility is right up into your wheelhouse as a city planner. I am really one of the few who recognized very early on that there was a need for there to be a conversation that engaged the city planner, engaged the mayor, engaged the county supervisor, because I realized that you're working on a 15-year plan, a future plan, or at least a 10-year, maybe even a 5-year plan. But there's certain responsibilities that you have in advancing your future outlook of what will be needed by either city, county, or even a state for that matter. And so that's one of the things that really fascinates me about urban air mobility, is that it really engages all these different levels of government, and it must engage all levels of government to be successful.
What sort of realistic timeline do you see for urban air mobility, assuming that all the pieces can be put together?
Right. Well, I don't think you're going to be moving early on. We're talking really like 2035 at the earliest, and in moving people through an autonomous taxi system. And you're not really talking about moving large amounts of people in a rapid fashion. At first, it's going to be folks who are probably higher up the economic ladder, and then it'll become something that's more accessible to those. There's some concepts out there that are pretty amazing. There's a company called Lilium out of Germany that's got a really amazing concept, and then Boeing and Aurora has got an amazing concept as well. And I've talked to both of those companies and some others about what their concepts look like. And it's pretty cool when you look at it and see how they're having to navigate, do we make this a 2-passenger vehicle? Do we make it a 4-passenger vehicle? Do we make it a 6-passenger vehicle? And oh, by the way, there's no pilot or anyone. There's not even a cockpit. There's not even a stick in these vehicles. So you're getting in, you're locking the door, and you're taking off.
What are you looking forward to most at Drone Focus?
Just seeing some old friends. It's always fun to come back to North Dakota and see old friends and catch up and learn new things. Now
you're also doing a podcast on drones yourself. What's it called?
So it's called Inside Unmanned Systems Drone Beat, and it was launched earlier, actually this month on May the 1st. It all came together after Richard Fisher, the publisher of Inside Unmanned Systems magazine, asked me and General James Poss, who used to run ISR for the Air Force, if I'd like to produce and co-host the show with James Poss.
What's the focus of the podcast?
Yeah, good question. So Inside Unmanned Systems Drone Beat is heavily focused on federal policy and topics you might read in the magazine. And so we take a UAS topic that is current, like some of the ones we talked about earlier today, and we drill down on the policy implications within a 4-part series. And we interview the brightest minds in the business. And then each of the 4 30-minute weekly episodes covers something a little differently, but it remains strictly on the chosen policy target for that series.
How do you like doing the podcast so far?
We're having a good time. I mean, we've got some really top, high flyers who really know what they're doing, and they know what's going on in the industry and the business. And it's a heck of a lot of fun to be able to have people on the show who really know what's going on in the industry. And so it couldn't be more fun.
I know the podcast is still new, but can you tell us about some of the shows you've done so far?
We had Counter UAS in the first series, and then our most recent series that's not been posted online yet. It'll be about 2 weeks from now when it gets posted. But we covered, of course, remote ID, and it was a heck of a lot of fun. We had Phil Kennel on the show, who is the chair of the ASTM F-38 committee, and we had Gabriel Cox, who's the chair of F-3802, which is the principal subcommittee on remote ID, and we had just a really good group of people. We had John Daniels there from Praxis Aerospace, and also had Matt Finelli with Verizon Skyward on the show. It's just nice for them to be able to just pretty much sometimes walk across the street to the National Press Club. And what we do is we have them join us at the National Press Club's broadcast studios in Washington, D.C.
I listened to a couple episodes, and I found it really interesting. I encourage any of my listeners that are out there, they want to see what's happening, especially from the federal policy level, to check your podcast out.
I appreciate that, Randy. It takes a heck of a lot of work, and I know you know that. And we're recording on each series 2 hours of product. And if you do listen to the podcast, you will not be disappointed if you're looking for golden nuggets of intelligence on federal policy and what's happening within the UAS space, because we really are trying our best to make sure that we get the right people at the right time, at the right place in the topic of the day.
And for my final question, Shawn, what message would you like to leave regarding the future of the drone industry?
There's a lot of work that has been done at so many different levels, at the test sites around the country, at the Northern Plains UAS test site in North Dakota, the broad area COAs that now allow folks to do things that they could not have even dreamt about a year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years ago. And so I would just encourage everyone to really leverage the opportunities that so many people in different parts of the country, and especially in North Dakota, have given you to prove out your idea. And you can no longer say that the policy is impeding. Well, you can a little bit in some places, but really the policies that have been developed, they're there now. The technology is there now. And we're getting very, very close to a point now where over the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to have this merging of policy and technology, and it's going to be a place where I think we're going to be pleased with, because I feel like in so many cases, we're going through this process in the right way, and we're doing it safely in the right way. And so I would just encourage everyone to do what they do best. And if drones can be applied to making it even better, then go out there and build a better mousetrap.
That's it for episode 214 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Shawn Bullard of the Duetto Group. I want to thank Shawn for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about the Duetto Group or want to connect with Shawn, check out the webpage at duettogroup.com. If you're interested in attending Drone Focus 2019, go to dronefocuscon.com. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1, you can help defray the cost of production. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com/donate or patreon.com/droneradioshow. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.